If Eden was only a myth, it would not need to be guarded. That sentence sounds simple, but it carries a weight most people never pause to feel. Myths live in books. They live in memory. They live in stories told and retold until they lose their edges. Myths do not sit behind restricted airspace. They do not require permits. They are not watched by soldiers or scanned by satellites. And yet there is a place on Earth that quietly fits the description of Eden more closely than anything else we know. A place that does not invite tourism. A place that does not welcome excavation. A place where access ends not with academic debate, but with authority. Southern Iraq. This is not where most people expect a story like this to begin. Eden is imagined as something distant and symbolic, a poetic origin story, a moral lesson dressed as geography. But the oldest version of that story never described Eden as symbolic. It described it as a location, a place with rivers, a place with boundaries, a place that could be left and never returned to. For thousands of years, no one questioned that detail. It was accepted as ancient imagination, until modern tools began to see what human eyes never could. In the early 21st century, satellites designed for military surveillance began mapping the ground beneath Mesopotamia. Their purpose was tactical. They were not searching for history. They were searching for threats, underground bunkers, hidden infrastructure, anything that might matter in a war zone. What they detected was not expected. Beneath the desert near one of the oldest known human settlements appeared patterns that did not belong to nature. Straight lines, symmetry, repeating geometry, depth far beyond what archaeologists had ever excavated. The data did not resemble a collapsed city or scattered ruins. It resembled planning. No announcement followed, no press release, no academic celebration. The information was classified and quietly set aside. That silence is the first clue. Before we go any further, feel free to let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. I always enjoy reading those messages, and there is something grounding about seeing how these questions travel across different places, different hours, and different parts of the world. And as always, the images you see here are only meant to provide atmosphere and context. Thank you for being here and for continuing to explore these ideas with us. If nothing of consequence had been found, there would have been no reason to hide it. Archaeology thrives on discovery. It rewards publication. Careers are built on proving something new. Silence only makes sense when discovery creates risk. To understand why this matters, we need to step back from satellites and politics and return to the story itself. The oldest version we have. In the book of Genesis, Eden is not introduced as heaven. It is introduced as land. A river flows out of it. That river divides into 4. Each branch has a name. 2 of those names still exist today. The Tigris, the Euphrates. They still flow through Iraq. This detail has always been uncomfortable. It anchors the story to the real world. It refuses to float freely as metaphor. If 2 rivers are real, then the others were once real as well. And if all 4 once converged, then the location of that convergence matters. Ancient writers were many things. Precise geographers were not among them. They did not invent specific river systems without reason. For centuries, scholars avoided this problem by calling it coincidence or poetic license. But geology has its own memory, and it does not rely on scripture. Modern imaging has revealed dry riverbeds buried beneath the sand of southern Iraq, ancient channels invisible from the ground, 4 major water systems that once flowed together before climate change and sediment erased them from view. They meet within the same region described in Genesis, within reach of one ancient city that stands apart from all others. Eridu. According to Sumerian tradition, Eridu was the first city, not the first capital, not the first successful settlement. the first city ever established. It was not founded by humans in their own telling, it was established by beings they called the gods. That statement alone is usually enough to end serious discussion. Gods are dismissed. Myth begins. Case closed. But archaeology introduces a problem. When researchers excavated Eridu, they expected to find gradual development, primitive huts at the deepest levels, simple tools, early attempts at permanence. That is how cities form. That is how civilization is supposed to work. They did not find that. The oldest layers of Eridu do not show a learning curve. They show complexity. The earlier structures were already organized, already monumental, already aligned. There is no evidence of trial and error, no rough beginning. The city appears as if it arrived already knowing what it was. That alone should have triggered global interest. It should have challenged timelines. It should have raised questions that reached far beyond Mesopotamia. Instead, excavation slowed. Permissions tightened. Focus shifted elsewhere. Official explanations describe Eridu as culturally sensitive, politically unstable, too dangerous to explore fully. These explanations sound reasonable until you notice a pattern. Other dangerous places are excavated all the time. Other politically unstable regions host international research. Risk does not normally stop archaeology when the potential reward is high, unless the reward is the problem. At this point, a conventional explanation usually appears. Eden was symbolic. Eridu is just an early city. Satellite anomalies are misinterpretations. Rivers change. Myths exaggerate. That explanation works only if you assume that every line of evidence exists in isolation. But history does not unfold in isolation. Patterns matter. Why would the earliest city sit precisely where ancient texts locate the origin of humanity? Why would that city resist conventional developmental models? Why would modern governments restrict access rather than encourage clarity? Why would advanced imaging quietly disappear into classified archives? And why does the story of Eden itself insist on something most myths never do? Exile. Adam and Eve are not destroyed. They are removed. They are sent out. Access is denied. A boundary is enforced. Guardians are placed to prevent return. That is not how myths usually end. Myths conclude with transformation or punishment. This one concludes with restriction. The story does not say Eden vanished. It says humans could no longer reach it. That distinction matters. In the ancient world, exile was a political act. Cities expelled people, borders were guarded, sacred spaces were protected. The language of Eden mirrors the language of real places. This raises a quiet and deeply uncomfortable possibility. What if Eden was never meant to be remembered as a paradise? What if it was remembered as a system, a controlled environment, a place humans once occupied and were later denied? If that were true, then forgetting would be necessary, not accidental. Necessary. Knowledge of origin is dangerous when it undermines authority. If humans once lived within a system they did not build, then understanding that system would change how they see themselves. It would raise questions no civilization built on hierarchy once asked. Who made us? Why? And who decides what we are allowed to know? This is where archaeology and modern power quietly intersect. When American forces entered Iraq in 2003, they secured oil fields. That was widely reported. What received far less attention was the immediate interest in archaeological sites. Not museums as symbols, but storage rooms. Not random artifacts, but specific tablets and seals. Looting happened. That much is public record. But investigators later noted something strange. The thefts were selective. Items of enormous value were ignored while less visually impressive objects were taken. Clay tablets, broken fragments, administrative records, the kind of material that does not sell well on the black market, but contains something far more valuable: information. At the same time, advanced satellite imaging was mapping the ground beneath the very region described in the oldest texts. The data did not circulate publicly. It did not inspire documentaries or museum exhibits. It vanished into classification. None of this proves Eden existed. That is not the claim. What it proves is that something in that region triggers a level of caution far beyond normal academic concern. Myths do not trigger that response. Coordinates do. This is where we pause, not to conclude, not to declare answers, but to acknowledge the first threshold. If Eden was only a story, there would be nothing to protect. If it was only metaphor, no one would care where it was located. If it never existed, access would not matter, and yet access does matter. Before we go further, we need to leave assumptions behind, both religious and skeptical. The question is not whether ancient people believed in Eden. The question is why modern institutions behave as if something there still matters. When we strip away legend and theology, what remains is a place that behaves strangely in the archaeological record. Eridu does not emerge as a hesitant beginning. It appears already formed, already organized, already knowing what it is meant to be. This is where the pattern stops being symbolic and starts becoming structural. Cities are not supposed to arrive fully formed. In every region of the world where archaeologists have traced the origins of settled life, the pattern is broadly the same. Small groups begin to stay in one place a little longer than before. Temporary shelters become more permanent. Storage pits appear. Tools become more specialized. Over generations, these modest changes accumulate until something recognizably urban emerges. This slow progression is the foundation upon which modern archaeology rests. Civilization is expected to grow, not appear. Eridu does not fit this expectation. From the moment serious excavation began, researchers noticed that something about the site felt out of sequence. Instead of crude beginnings at the deepest levels, they encountered organized structures that already reflected planning, intention, and hierarchy. The earliest layers that have been reached do not show people experimenting with permanence. They show people executing it. Raised platforms were already in place. Sacred spaces were already defined. Water management was already integrated into the layout. These were not the hesitant steps of a society learning how to build a city. They were the actions of a society that already understood what a city was meant to be. Attempts to explain this away usually rely on familiar assumptions. Perhaps earlier stages existed elsewhere, and the knowledge migrated to Eridu already developed. Perhaps the most primitive layers were eroded or destroyed. Perhaps we simply have not excavated deeply enough to find the missing transition. On the surface, these explanations sound reasonable. Archaeology often deals with incomplete records and lost material, but when Eridu is compared to other early centers of civilization, the problem becomes harder to dismiss. In Egypt, the earlier settlements show gradual refinement over time. In the Indus Valley, small villages slowly evolve into planned cities. In China, pottery styles and construction techniques change incrementally, leaving behind a visible trail of learning. In Mesopotamia alone, the trail seems to vanish at the very moment it should be most visible. What makes this more unsettling is that the Sumerians themselves never claimed authorship over their own civilization. In their texts, they do not describe inventing writing, law, or urban life through human ingenuity. They describe receiving these things. Kingship is said to descend from heaven. The rules of society are presented as established before humans govern themselves. City plans are portrayed as ordained rather than discovered. This is usually dismissed as religious humility or mythological exaggeration, but the consistency of these claims across texts suggests something more deliberate. These are not isolated metaphors. They form a coherent explanation of origin that aligns uncomfortably well with what the ground itself reveals. Eridu is remembered in Sumerian tradition not as one city among many, but as the first city. Not the first successful experiment in settlement, but the initial point from which everything else followed. Archaeology supports its extreme antiquity, yet also confirms that its earliest known form does not resemble a beginning. Instead, it resembles a continuation. The city appears as though it were built according to principles already understood, using patterns already established, following rules that did not need to be invented on site. This raises a question archaeology rarely asks directly. If Eridu was not developed through gradual local experimentation, then where did its organizing knowledge originate? There are only a few possible answers. One is migration, the idea that a more advanced group arrived from elsewhere and imposed structure on the region. But this explanation requires evidence of that source culture. Transitional settlements, tools, or parallel sites would need to exist somewhere in the archaeological record. None have been found. Another possibility is inheritance, the idea that knowledge survived from an earlier phase of humanity that no longer exists in recognizable form. In this scenario, Eridu would not represent the birth of civilization, but its reappearance. A city built using remembered principles rather than newly discovered ones. Inheritance carries an implication that is deeply uncomfortable. It implies loss. It suggests that something existed before Eridu that did not survive intact, and that the people who built Eridu were maintaining a system they did not fully understand rather than inventing one from scratch. This would explain why later Mesopotamian architecture becomes conservative rather than innovative. Forms are repeated faithfully, proportions remain fixed, orientations do not change. Ritual replaces experimentation. Precision is preserved, but curiosity narrows. This is not stagnation born of ignorance. It is preservation born of uncertainty. This pattern appears elsewhere in the ancient world. In Egypt, the earliest monumental constructions are often the most precise. In megalithic cultures, the oldest stonework frequently displays levels of accuracy that later builders struggle to replicate. Technology usually improves over time. Memory does not. Memory preserves results even as methods fade. Eridu feels like memory encoded in stone. There is another detail that deepens the mystery. Excavations at Eridu have never reached the deepest layers of the site, not because it is impossible, but because it is restricted. Over decades, permits have limited how far archaeologists are allowed to dig. Focus has been redirected towards surface features and later periods. The deeper strata remain largely unexplored. Official explanations cite preservation concerns, political instability, and logistical difficulty. Yet modern archaeology possesses tools capable of deep excavation with minimal disturbance, and these justifications grow thinner as time passes. This leads to a difficult but unavoidable question. If the earliest accessible layers of Eridu already appear complete, what lies beneath them? Deeper excavation would not reveal primitive beginnings. It would reveal something else entirely: foundations, infrastructure, evidence that the city was built atop something older. Cities constructed from nothing adapt to terrain. Cities constructed over existing systems conform to them. Eridu conforms. Its layout follows patterns that seem imposed rather than discovered. Water channels align with an efficiency that suggests planning beyond immediate need. Sacred spaces sit precisely where functionality would demand them, not where symbolism alone would place them. Function comes first. Meaning follows. That order matters. Skeptics often respond by pointing to human ingenuity. Given enough time, humans can plan complex systems without predecessors. Occasionally, a culture leaps forward, but this argument weakens when the same anomaly repeats across multiple regions and eras. The oldest examples are often the most refined. Later versions simplify rather than advance. This is not the signature of invention, it is the signature of inheritance slowly forgetting its source. If Eridu represents inheritance rather than origin, then it stands not as the cradle of civilization, but as its boundary marker, a place built at the edge of memory, a city that remembers a world humans no longer fully recall. In this light, the story of Eden begins to shift, not as a myth of moral failure, but as a memory of separation, a place that once existed within reach, then fell beyond it. Architecture and soil can show us what was built and where it stood. They cannot tell us how that world was understood. For that, we have to turn to something far more resilient than stone: language. Not poetry or belief, but vocabulary itself, because words preserve knowledge long after comprehension fades, and sometimes they remember things they were never meant to explain. When physical structures vanish, language often remains. Stone erodes, wood rots, cities collapse and are buried. But words persist, carried forward not because people fully understand them, but because they continue to be used. Language is one of the most reliable archives of human experience, and it preserves traces of knowledge long after the context that produced that knowledge has disappeared. This is why linguistics can sometimes reveal things archaeology cannot. The Sumerian language presents a problem that has never been fully resolved. It is what linguists call an isolate, meaning it has no known relatives. It does not clearly descend from any earlier language family, nor does it evolve into any later one. It appears suddenly in the historical record already complex, already capable of expressing abstract concepts, legal ideas, technical instructions, and cosmological descriptions. There is no visible period of linguistic infancy, no gradual build-up from simpler forms. The language arrives already equipped to describe a sophisticated world. This alone is unusual, but the deeper issue lies in what the language is capable of describing. Languages develop vocabulary in response to lived experience. People create words for tools they use, systems they understand, and phenomena they regularly encounter. You do not develop precise terminology for concepts that do not exist in your reality. Yet Sumerian contains words that imply an awareness of systems and processes that should not have been accessible to a society at what is considered the dawn of civilization. One of the most important of these words is often translated as divine power or sacred order. In Sumerian, it is the word me. Modern translations tend to treat it as a vague religious concept, something like fate or cosmic authority. But when the word is examined in context, its meaning becomes more precise and more unsettling. The me are not abstract virtues. They are listed, catalogued, transferred, stolen, and returned. They govern specific functions of society and nature. Kings can possess them. Gods can distribute them. Entire cities can lose them. This is not how symbolic religious ideas behave. This is how functional systems behave. In modern terms, the me resemble instructions or encoded rules, a set of parameters that determine how something operates. They define kingship, craftsmanship, law, sexuality, agriculture, even conflict. The texts describe a world in which these rules exist independently of human will and can be moved from one place to another. This is not mythology in the poetic sense. It is closer to information theory than theology. Another word deepens the pattern. Abzu is traditionally translated as the primordial waters, the freshwater abyss beneath the earth from which life emerges. In mythological summaries, it is treated as a symbolic underworld or cosmic ocean. But in technical contexts, Abzu behaves differently. It is described as a source of wisdom, a place of power, a location rather than a concept. The god associated with Abzu resides there, not metaphorically but spatially. Temples are said to be built directly over it, as if its presence beneath the ground mattered. If Abzu were merely a mythological ocean, there would be no reason to anchor it to specific sites. Yet Eridu is repeatedly identified as sitting above the Abzu. The city is described as drawing sustenance and authority from what lies beneath it. This begins to resemble not a story about water, but a story about a buried system, something unseen but essential, something that supports life and order from below. Language preserves another clue in how creation itself is described. In Sumerian texts, humans are not spoken into existence. They are formed. Materials are combined. Processes are repeated until a viable result is achieved. Several early accounts describe failed attempts before success. This is not how purely symbolic creation myths usually function. Symbolic myths emphasize intent and outcome. These emphasize procedure. The materials themselves are telling. Humans are made from clay, mixed with the essence of the gods. Modern readers often interpret this as poetic imagery, earth and spirit, matter and divinity. But ancient people used metaphor pragmatically. Clay referred to biological material, something malleable, something shaped. Essence or blood referred to life force, lineage, or inherited properties. The description is crude, but it is directional. It points toward manipulation rather than spontaneous creation. What makes this linguistic evidence difficult to dismiss is its consistency. The same technical tone appears across administrative texts, religious hymns, and mythological narratives. The language does not shift into a different register when describing the gods. It remains practical, transactional, procedural. The gods argue, they negotiate, they allocate resources, they establish rules. This is not the language of abstract spirituality. It is the language of governance. This creates a quiet contradiction with the standard narrative of early human consciousness. We are told that early civilizations explained the world through myth because they lacked scientific understanding. But the Sumerian texts do not read like attempts to explain natural phenomena they did not understand. They read like attempts to record systems they no longer fully controlled. When people do not understand something at all, they mythologize it freely. When they partially understand something, they preserve it carefully. They repeat formulas, they guard words, they follow rules even when the reason behind them has faded. This is exactly what the Sumerian texts suggest. Knowledge preserved beyond comprehension. Linguists often point out that languages simplify over time unless actively maintained. Complexity requires continuity. The sudden appearance of a highly complex language without visible ancestors suggests either an abrupt cognitive shift or the inheritance of an already mature system. If language emerged alongside civilization gradually, its structure should reflect that process. Sumerian does not. The implications of this are subtle but profound. If language remembers systems older than recorded history, then written texts may not be inventions, but echoes. Not the birth of ideas, but their last clear expression before forgetting sets in. This returns us again to Eridu, a city that appears complete, a language that arrives prepared, a body of texts that describe systems rather than dreams. Together they form a pattern that resists simple explanation. If Eden was remembered as a place of origin, then language may be the last place where traces of that origin survive intact. Not as stories meant to inspire belief, but as technical descriptions filtered through memory and ritual. But language can only carry us so far. Words preserve meaning, not consequence. Beneath language lies geology, and geology does not remember symbolically. It records events, pressure, heat, water, destruction. The earth beneath Mesopotamia carries evidence of something that stories alone could never invent. Stories can be dismissed as metaphor, but the ground does not speak in symbols. It records what happened with an indifference that makes it one of the most reliable witnesses to the deep past. Layers of soil accumulate slowly. Sediment settles where water once flowed. Destruction leaves signatures that cannot be argued away by belief or tradition. This is why geology has a unique power in discussions of ancient history. It does not care what people believed. It only records what occurred. For a long time, the flood stories of Mesopotamia were treated as mythology shaped by fear of rivers and seasonal inundation. The Tigris and Euphrates are unpredictable. Flooding was common. It seemed natural that ancient societies would turn this danger into moral narrative. According to this view, the Great Flood was nothing more than exaggeration layered onto local experience. But geology complicates that explanation in uncomfortable ways. Excavations across southern Mesopotamia have revealed a distinct layer of fine silt separating earlier settlements from later ones. This layer appears at multiple sites including Uruk-Kish and regions near Eridu. It is not a thin seasonal deposit. In some places it is several feet thick. It contains little evidence of human activity, no hearths, no tools, no gradual transition. Life simply stops beneath it and resumes above it. Whatever caused this layer was not a typical river flood. It was widespread, sudden and disruptive enough to erase entire communities. Radiocarbon dating places this event thousands of years before the biblical account of Noah, but closely aligns with the Sumerian flood narratives. This alone challenges the idea that these stories were moral inventions. They appear instead to be memories of a real catastrophe preserved across generations. The names change, the lessons shift, but the event remains. What makes the Sumerian version of the flood especially revealing is how it is described. It is not framed as punishment for moral failure. Humans are not destroyed because they are sinful. They are destroyed because they are numerous and disruptive, too loud, too many. This is not the language of theology. It is the language of management. The flood reads less like divine wrath and more like a decision made by authorities struggling to control a growing population. From a geological perspective, the flood layer does not suggest a slow rising of water over months. It suggests rapid deposition, the kind associated with massive water displacement, a sudden surge, a catastrophic release, something far larger than seasonal overflow. Here, archaeology usually reaches for climate change, melting glaciers, rising sea levels, regional shifts at the end of the last ice age. These explanations account for many ancient floods and should not be dismissed, but they do not fully explain the uniformity and abruptness seen across Mesopotamian sites. Nor do they explain why the event was remembered so clearly and so consistently. There is another detail often overlooked. After the flood, civilization does not restart from scratch. It resumes. Writing returns, kingship returns, city building continues. This implies continuity of knowledge across the catastrophe. Someone survived who understood how the system worked. Someone preserved memory while the physical world was erased. This again points away from a purely natural disaster. Natural disasters scatter populations and break continuity. The Mesopotamian flood appears to have reset society without erasing its underlying structure. That is a strange outcome if the event was entirely uncontrolled. The earth beneath Iraq holds another anomaly that deepens this mystery. In several locations, geologists have identified materials that should not exist in ancient contexts. Glassy residues formed only under extreme heat, temperatures far higher than those produced by ordinary fires or even volcanic activity. These materials are rare and specific. They form when sand is exposed to sudden intense energy. Under normal circumstances, such material is associated with lightning strikes or meteor impacts. Lightning creates fulgurites, thin branching glass structures. Meteor impacts create craters, shock metamorphism, and widespread destruction. Neither of these signatures appears in southern Mesopotamia. There are no impact craters, no volcanic history. No geological processes that can easily account for the presence of extreme heat residues in controlled patterns. The flood layer and the heat signatures together suggest a sequence rather than a single event. Destruction followed by inundation. Heat followed by water. This combination is difficult to explain through gradual environmental change alone. It implies an energetic disturbance capable of reshaping both land and settlement. At this point, skepticism usually reasserts itself. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Ancient people could not have produced such effects. Therefore, the explanation must be natural, even if it is not yet fully understood. That reasoning is sound as a principle, but incomplete as an investigation. When evidence does not fit existing models, the role of science is to revise the models, not to ignore the evidence. The ground does not care what humans think is possible. It only preserves what happened. If a catastrophic event occurred that ancient societies experienced as overwhelming, sudden, and transformative, they would remember it. They would encode it in stories, laws, and rituals. They would warn future generations. They would frame it in the language they had available. Flood myths are not unique to Mesopotamia. They appear across cultures separated by oceans. This is often explained as coincidence or shared human fear, but geology suggests something else. It suggests that multiple regions experience massive disruptions within overlapping timeframes, events large enough to imprint themselves on collective memory. The question is not whether a flood occurred. The evidence says it did. The question is, what kind of event produces destruction, heat, and water on a scale that resets civilizations while leaving behind enough survivors to remember what was lost? If Eden existed as a system rather than a garden, then its destruction would not look like a moral fall. It would look like infrastructure failure or deliberate shutdown. Systems do not collapse gently, they fail catastrophically. The flood layer beneath Mesopotamia may not mark the beginning of civilization as traditionally imagined. It may mark the end of something earlier, a boundary between a world that functioned differently and the world humans rebuilt afterward. But water alone does not explain what was lost. Beneath the sediment lie materials that should not exist at all. Traces of extreme heat that challenge not only ancient memory, but the limits of modern scientific comfort. There are moments when evidence does not simply challenge interpretation, but challenges possibility itself. Materials that should not exist in a given time period force a different kind of question. Not what did people believe, but what actually happened. In southern Iraq, researchers have encountered such a problem in the form of heat-altered material embedded in ancient geological layers where no known natural process should have produced it. The material in question is glassy and fused, formed when sand or soil is exposed to temperatures far beyond those generated by ordinary fire. To transform loose sediment into this kind of vitrified residue requires sudden and extreme energy. Modern science is very clear about the conditions under which this occurs. It happens at nuclear test sites. It happens at ground zero after intense detonation. It does not occur quietly, and it does not occur accidentally. When similar material was identified in Mesopotamian contexts, the initial reaction was disbelief. Contamination was suspected. Modern military activity in the region provided an easy explanation. Samples were retested. Surrounding strata were dated. The results did not align with recent history. The material was ancient, deeply embedded. It belonged to the same layers associated with early settlements and flood deposits. Natural explanations were proposed. Meteor impacts can generate extreme heat. Lightning can fuse sand into glass. Volcanic activity can alter landscapes dramatically. Each of these possibilities was examined and each presented a problem. There are no confirmed impact craters in the region. Lightning creates thin branching structures rather than widespread fused layers. Southern Mesopotamia has no volcanic history capable of producing the temperatures required. What remains is not a conclusion, but a contradiction. Heat of extraordinary intensity was present where no accepted natural mechanism can fully account for it. This is where discussion often becomes uncomfortable because modern frameworks quietly assume limits on ancient capability. If ancient people could not produce such heat, then the heat must have come from nature. If nature cannot easily explain it, then the evidence is minimized or left unresolved. But the ground does not negotiate with assumptions. It records outcomes, not intentions. The distribution of these heat-altered residues adds another layer of complexity. They are not scattered randomly. They appear in patterns, concentrated zones separated by areas that show no similar effects. This does not resemble the chaos of a meteor impact. It resembles controlled release, targeted energy rather than diffuse destruction. This pattern mirrors something modern science understands very well. When energy is released deliberately, it produces boundaries, sharp transitions, clear zones of effect. Nature tends to blur its edges. Control creates lines. It is important to pause here and avoid a common mistake. The presence of extreme heat does not automatically imply advanced technology in the way modern people imagine it. It implies capability, not context. A society does not need to understand nuclear physics as we do to produce catastrophic energy. It only needs access to a process that releases it. Ancient descriptions often frame destruction as the action of gods. Fire from the sky, radiance that kills without touch, lands rendered barren. These phrases are usually treated as metaphor. But metaphors emerge from experience. People describe unfamiliar phenomena using familiar language. Fire is not a scientific term. It is a visual memory. If an event occurred that produced intense heat followed by widespread flooding, it would be remembered as divine action. Not because people believed in gods, but because they lacked vocabulary for mechanisms. They recorded effect, not cause. The flood layer discussed earlier may represent the aftermath rather than the primary event. Water follows disruption, rivers change course, ice melts, sediment moves. Heat destabilizes systems that water then completes. This sequence aligns with ancient narratives more closely than gradual climate change alone. Destruction comes first, survival follows, memory remains. At this point, the question shifts subtly. It is no longer about whether something unusual happened. The evidence suggests it did. The question becomes whether ancient societies were witnesses or participants. Were they victims of forces beyond their control, or were they living within a system that failed? If Eden was infrastructure rather than a garden, then its failure would not look like moral punishment. It would look like environmental collapse triggered by energy release. The survivors would remember fire and water. They would not remember equations or engineering. Modern reluctance to consider this possibility is understandable. It challenges assumptions about linear progress and human uniqueness. But dismissing evidence because it feels disruptive is not a scientific response. It is a cultural one. The heat traces beneath Mesopotamia do not tell us who acted or why. They tell us only that something capable of producing extraordinary energy existed in a context where it should not. That fact alone is enough to demand further investigation. Instead, investigation narrowed. Funding disappeared. Discussion moved to the margins. The material became a footnote rather than a focus. When anomalies are consistently ignored, they cease to be anomalies. They become patterns of avoidance. The ground can tell us what happened to the land. It cannot tell us how living beings survived it. For that, we have to turn inward, to the body itself, because biology records what geology cannot, and the human genome carries traces that are just as difficult to ignore. Geology records what happened to the land, but biology records what happened to the living beings who endured it. If a catastrophic event reshaped the world and reset human societies, then its traces would not exist only in soil and stone. They would also be written into the bodies of the survivors. This is where the discussion moves from ancient memory to something far more intimate and far harder to dismiss: the human genome. Modern genetics has allowed researchers to reconstruct migration patterns and population histories with remarkable precision. By comparing ancient DNA with that of living populations, scientists can trace where people came from, how they moved, and how different groups are related. For the most part, these studies confirm what archaeology already suggests. But in a small number of cases, they introduce questions that remain unresolved. Ancient DNA samples taken from sites in Mesopotamia reveal a pattern that does not fit neatly into established models of human evolution. The majority of genetic markers align with what would be expected from early Near Eastern populations, ancestral to modern groups in the region. But a small percentage consistently does not. These sequences are not foreign in the sense of being non-human. They code for human biology, but they do not match any known lineage within the established human family tree. At first, this was assumed to be error. Contamination is a constant concern in ancient DNA research. Samples degrade, modern material intrudes. Sequencing mistakes occur. The tests were repeated. Independent laboratories were consulted. The anomalies remained. The conclusion, published in cautious academic language, suggested the possibility of an unidentified archaic human population that contributed genetic material to early Mesopotamians. On the surface, this explanation seems sufficient. We know that Homo sapiens interbred with Neanderthals and Denisovans. Genetic mixing with unknown groups is not unprecedented. But this answer raises another question that is rarely addressed. Where is the archaeological evidence of this unknown population? Neanderthals left tools, burials, and settlements. Denisovans left traces in caves. An entire population capable of contributing genetic material across Mesopotamia should have left something behind. It has not been found. This absence creates a gap between biological evidence and material culture. Genetics suggests interaction. Archaeology suggests silence. The gap becomes more interesting when placed alongside ancient texts. Sumerian creation accounts describe humanity not as a natural continuation of earlier beings, but as a constructed one. Humans are formed through deliberate combination. The process involves repeated attempts, adjustments, and eventual success. These descriptions are usually interpreted as symbolic, but symbols typically compress meaning. These texts expand it. They describe failure, iteration, and refinement. When viewed through a biological lens, this language sounds less like metaphor and more like observation filtered through limited understanding. Ancient writers did not have words for genetics or molecular biology. They described what they could see: mixing, formation, lineage, blood. The notion that humanity might be incomplete or altered by design is deeply unsettling. It challenges not only religious narratives, but scientific ones as well. Evolution is built on gradual adaptation driven by environmental pressure. Sudden coordinated changes across populations are difficult to explain within that framework. Modern humans exhibit several traits that appear abruptly in the fossil record: complex language, symbolic thought, advanced social structures, art, music, and abstract reasoning. These do not emerge slowly over hundreds of thousands of years. They appear within a relatively narrow window. Something changes. The pace accelerates. The human mind crosses a threshold. Standard explanations point to a genetic mutation or cognitive revolution, but mutations do not coordinate across regions without extensive time. Cultural transmission alone does not account for biological change. The question of why this shift occurred when it did remains open. If a small percentage of ancient DNA does not align with known lineages, then it may represent more than an extinct population. It may represent intervention. Not necessarily external in the sense of non-terrestrial, but external in the sense of outside the normal flow of human evolution. This possibility does not require imagining beings descending from the sky in shining vessels. It requires only acknowledging that a group with advanced knowledge of biology existed earlier than we assume. A group capable of altering life in subtle ways. Such a group would not leave behind obvious monuments. It would leave behind changes that look natural until examined closely. The resistance to this idea is understandable. It raises ethical questions that reach far beyond history. If humanity was modified, then who decided how? If our cognitive abilities were shaped, then to what end? And if traces of that modification still exist, then what does that say about human equality and shared origin? These questions are not easily contained within academic boundaries. They spill into philosophy, politics, and identity. This may explain why research in this area tends to stall. Funding dries up. Further study is postponed. Safer explanations are preferred, but preference does not change evidence. The anomalous DNA does not tell us who intervened or why. It tells us only that the genetic history of humanity may not be as straightforward as textbooks suggest. Combined with archaeological patterns, linguistic anomalies, and geological disruptions, it forms part of a larger picture. A picture in which humanity appears not as the first intelligent system to arise on Earth, but as one shaped within a pre-existing framework. If Eden was a controlled environment, then the humans who lived there may not have been exactly as we are now. Exile would not only remove access to a place, it would remove access to processes that sustained a certain state of being. Over generations, that state would fade. Memory would replace function. Ritual would replace understanding. This would explain why ancient texts speak of humans who lived longer, who possessed greater knowledge, and who were closer to the gods. These descriptions are often dismissed as exaggeration, but exaggeration is usually directional. It grows from something real. Biology tells us what endured, but it does not explain what was built. To understand that, we have to return to the physical world from a different angle, not through destruction but through technology. Scattered across the ancient world are devices and constructions that should not exist where and when they do, and like the genome, they raise the same uncomfortable question, not whether ancient people were clever, but whether they inherited knowledge they did not originate. Technology is often treated as a straight line. Simple tools lead to better tools. Better tools lead to complex systems. Once a society learns how to do something, it rarely forgets how to do it entirely. Knowledge may shift or adapt, but it usually accumulates. This assumption underlies much of modern thinking about progress. It is also one of the most fragile assumptions when confronted with the ancient world. Across multiple regions and time periods, there are objects and constructions that appear suddenly at a high level of sophistication and then disappear without clear descendants. They do not fit comfortably into a narrative of gradual improvement. Instead, they behave like isolated peaks rising from a much lower landscape. For a brief moment, something exists that should not, and then it is gone. One of the most well-known examples comes from the ancient Mediterranean. A complex mechanical device built from interlocking bronze gears, capable of tracking celestial cycles, predicting eclipses, and modelling planetary motion. Its precision rivals clockwork that would not appear again until many centuries later. The mechanism was not a toy or a decorative object, it was a computational instrument, and yet it exists alone. No workshop tradition, no earlier prototypes, no later refinements. It appears fully realized and then vanishes from history. The usual explanation is loss. The device was rare. Knowledge was confined to a small group. When that group disappeared, the technology disappeared with it. This explanation is plausible but incomplete. Technologies that solve real problems tend to spread. They are copied, simplified, adapted. Even when empires fall, basic principles survive. That is not what we see here. we see a level of sophistication that leaves no technological lineage behind. A similar pattern appears in Mesopotamia itself. Near modern Baghdad, archaeologists discovered a simple ceramic vessel containing a copper cylinder and an iron rod. When filled with a mild acidic solution, it produces an electrical current. The device functions as a battery. The materials are ordinary. The principle is sound. Yet there is no clear explanation for why such a device would be created, or how the knowledge required to produce it would then vanish entirely. Mainstream interpretations suggest it may have been used for electroplating or ritual purposes, but this raises more questions than it answers. Electroplating requires not just a current, but a system. Knowledge of conductors' electrolytes and consistent application. No such system appears in the archaeological record. If electricity was discovered accidentally and used even in a limited way, it would leave traces. It does not. Moving further back in time, the pattern becomes even harder to reconcile. In southeastern Turkey, a massive stone complex predating agriculture by several thousand years stands as a direct challenge to accepted timelines. Enormous pillars carved with intricate reliefs, arranged with clear astronomical awareness. This site was not a village. It was not a shelter. It was a place of gathering and coordination built by people who, according to standard models, should not have been capable of organizing such work. Even more puzzling is what happened next. The site was deliberately buried, not destroyed, not abandoned, carefully filled in and preserved. This act required enormous effort. Someone decided that whatever the site represented should be sealed away rather than allowed to erode or collapse naturally. Burial is not the behavior of ignorance, it is the behavior of custodians. If these examples stood alone, they could be dismissed as anomalies. History is full of curiosities, but they do not stand alone. Similar patterns appear in Egypt, in South America, in South Asia. Precision stonework that later cultures could not replicate. Alignments that require advanced astronomical knowledge. Mathematical relationships embedded in architecture that imply more than trial and error. What connects these cases is not mystery, but discontinuity. Technologies appear without visible development and disappear without clear explanation. This suggests not invention, but transmission. Knowledge arriving from somewhere else and then failing to sustain itself over time. One reason technologies disappear is that they depend on systems larger than the object itself. A device can exist without its infrastructure, but it cannot be maintained or reproduced. Once the supporting system collapses, the technology becomes a relic, a curiosity, a puzzle. If Eden functioned as a central system, then technologies associated with it would not be evenly distributed or widely taught. They would be controlled, access would be limited, knowledge would be concentrated. When the system failed or access was denied, these technologies would not slowly degrade into simpler forms. They would simply stop. This pattern aligns with what we see. Advanced artifacts scattered without lineage. High-precision construction followed by decline. Knowledge preserved in ritual rather than innovation. Results remembered without methods. Ancient texts support this interpretation indirectly. They speak of gifts from the gods, of knowledge given rather than discovered, of tools and techniques that arrive already complete. These descriptions are often dismissed as mythic embellishment. But when paired with physical evidence, they begin to look like imperfect records of something real. The reluctance to accept this possibility stems not from lack of evidence, but from discomfort with its implications. If ancient societies inherited knowledge from a prior system, then progress is not a simple upward climb. It is cyclical. Systems rise, they fail. Survivors rebuild using fragments of what remains. This does not diminish human achievement. It reframes it. It suggests resilience rather than novelty, preservation rather than invention. The technologies scattered through the ancient world may not represent humanity discovering its first tools. They may represent humanity struggling to remember how to use tools it once took for granted. We return to Eden itself, not through text or artifact, but through structure, pattern, and geometry. Beneath Eridu, modern imaging reveals something that does not resemble a city in the traditional sense. It resembles a system. When people imagine ancient cities, they picture streets, walls, temples, and homes clustered together in patterns shaped by trade defense and daily life. Cities grow outward from practical needs. They adapt to terrain. Their forms are irregular because human activity is irregular. What lies beneath Eridu does not match this expectation. Modern imaging suggests something far more deliberate and far more constrained. Ground-penetrating radar and satellite-based sensing technologies have revealed subsurface structures near Eridu that do not resemble conventional urban ruins. Instead of scattered foundations and collapsed walls, the patterns show symmetry, curving geometry, repetition, a central formation from which multiple channels extend outward. This is not the footprint of organic settlement, it is the footprint of design. The most striking feature is a large spiral-like structure buried deep beneath the surface. It is not shallow. It extends far below the depth of any known ancient excavation in the region. From this central form, several channels radiate outward in evenly spaced directions. 4 of these are significantly larger than the others and align with the cardinal directions. The resemblance to the ancient description of a central source feeding multiple rivers is difficult to ignore. In traditional readings, the rivers of Eden are taken literally. Water flows, land is irrigated, life flourishes. But water is only one way to describe flow. Ancient languages often use the same words to describe movement, whether of liquid energy or authority. What matters is not the substance but the direction. Something originates at the center and distributes outward. From an engineering perspective, a spiral is not decorative. It is efficient. It allows controlled distribution within a compact footprint. It maximizes surface interaction. Modern systems use spiral forms for managing energy, heat, and information. Nature itself uses spirals for the same reason. When humans adopt this geometry, it is usually because function demands it. The channels extending from the central structure beneath Eridu appear too uniform to be agricultural. Irrigation adapts to terrain. These channels impose geometry on terrain. They are evenly spaced and consistently oriented as if designed to serve a system rather than fields. Their scale suggests distribution beyond local need. Thermal imaging adds another layer to the picture. The central region beneath Eridu displays subtle but persistent temperature anomalies. The ground is warmer than surrounding areas. This difference is not dramatic enough to indicate volcanic activity, and the region has no volcanic history. Yet it is consistent enough to suggest residual heat or ongoing interaction below the surface. Ancient texts describe Eridu as sitting above the Abzu, the source of wisdom and life. Traditionally, this is translated as subterranean water, but in functional terms, Abzu behaves less like an ocean and more like a reservoir, a source that feeds the system above it, a place that matters not for its symbolism but for its position. If Abzu were a natural aquifer, it would not require such elaborate textual emphasis. Aquifers are common. They do not define civilizations. What defines civilizations are systems that regulate access to resources, control rather than abundance. The idea that Eden was a garden persists because it is comforting. Gardens are passive. They grow. They require care but not understanding. Systems are different. Systems require regulation. They impose limits. They function only as long as their rules are followed. Ancient descriptions of Eden include boundaries and guardians. Access is restricted. return is forbidden. These details are often interpreted morally, but they read just as clearly in functional terms. Systems fail when unregulated. Once access is lost, it cannot simply be regained by desire. The structure beneath Eridu does not resemble a temple complex or palace foundation. It resembles infrastructure, something designed to operate continuously, something meant to remain hidden, something that would not benefit from exposure. Cities are built to be seen. Systems are often buried. This perspective reframes many ancient descriptions. The tree of life at the center of Eden has traditionally been imagined as a literal tree. But ancient cultures frequently used the image of a tree to represent networks, hierarchies, and flow. Branches carry nourishment. Roots draw from hidden sources. A tree connects above and below. In several traditions, the tree of life is described as luminous. Its fruit grants vitality. Its presence sustains the environment. These are not typical botanical descriptions. They sound more like accounts of something powered, something that alters its surroundings. If Eden was a system, then the expulsion of humans from it was not punishment. It was disconnection, removal from a network that sustained a particular state of existence. Once removed, humans would still live but differently. Shorter lifespans, limited knowledge, fragmented memory. This would explain why later civilizations remember Eden not as a place they can return to, but as a lost condition. Something humanity once lived within and then fell away from. Modern resistance to this idea stems from habit. We categorize ancient stories as myth and modern structures as technology. But this distinction may be artificial. Technology that outlasts understanding becomes myth. Systems remembered without context become gods. The structure beneath Eridu suggests that something was built there that does not fit neatly into either category. It is neither simple settlement nor abstract symbol. It is a pattern that implies purpose beyond habitation. If Eden was infrastructure, its existence would never have been celebrated openly. It would have been controlled, access limited, knowledge regulated. And once the system failed or was shut down, it would have been safer to let it fade into story than to preserve its reality. That logic extends into the present, because if Eden were only ancient history, its remnants would be treated like any other ruin. What we see instead is silence, restriction, and avoidance, reactions that reveal as much as any artifact ever could. If Eden were nothing more than an ancient ruin, its treatment would follow a familiar pattern. Archaeologists would debate its significance. Universities would compete for access. Excavations would expand as new technologies made deeper exploration possible. Disagreement would play out in journals, conferences, and documentaries. That is how history normally unfolds when a site matters. Eridu does not follow that pattern. Instead of open competition, there is hesitation. Instead of deeper excavation, there are limits. Instead of sustained international collaboration, there is silence. Over time, this silence has become one of the most consistent features surrounding the site. It is not loud enough to provoke outrage and not explicit enough to demand explanation. It simply exists, and that is what makes it revealing. Across the past century, multiple archaeological teams have attempted to explore Eridu beyond its surface layers. Several of these efforts ended abruptly. Permits were withdrawn, funding disappeared, research priorities were redirected. In some cases, individual researchers died under circumstances that were officially ruled accidental or natural, but which collectively form an uncomfortable pattern. 8 archaeologists over several decades working at the same site meeting untimely ends is statistically unlikely. Yet the pattern is rarely discussed in mainstream scholarship. Modern archaeology operates under international frameworks designed to protect cultural heritage. These frameworks are meant to encourage transparency, preservation, and cooperation. In practice, Eridu has repeatedly been classified as sensitive. Excavation depth is restricted. Certain survey methods are discouraged. Data circulation is limited. These decisions are justified using language that sounds reasonable but lacks specificity. Security concerns, preservation issues, regional instability. What is rarely acknowledged is that other sites in equally unstable regions do not face the same level of constraint. Advanced imaging has been used in conflict zones across the world. Deep excavations have proceeded in politically complex environments. Risk alone does not explain Eridu. The silence extends beyond archaeology into modern intelligence behavior. During the 2003 invasion of Iraq, American forces deployed specialized units that included not only soldiers, but linguists, anthropologists, and technical specialists. Their presence at museums and archaeological sites was not incidental. Internal reports and later testimonies indicate that specific artifacts were prioritized. Items that carried information rather than aesthetic value were removed while others were left behind. This was not chaotic looting. It was selective extraction. Clay tablets, administrative records, and fragments of text disappeared while visually valuable objects were ignored. These choices suggest intent. Someone knew what mattered. Someone understood which pieces carried knowledge that could not be easily replaced. At the same time, satellite data from the region was classified. Imaging that revealed anomalous subsurface structures did not enter academic circulation. It did not become part of open debate. It became restricted. Silence of this kind does not occur accidentally. It requires coordination across institutions that do not normally cooperate easily. Academic bodies, governments, military organizations, and religious authorities operate according to different priorities. When all of them avoid the same subject, it suggests shared risk. Religious institutions have long had an interest in Mesopotamia. This is not controversial. The region is foundational to biblical history. Expeditions sponsored by religious bodies have operated there for centuries. What is less discussed is the focus of some of these missions. Rather than early Christian sites, they often targeted pre-biblical locations. Sumerian cities, Babylonian temples, places that predate Abrahamic tradition. Private journals and correspondence from certain expeditions describe discoveries that conflicted with established doctrine. These materials were sealed, not destroyed, but archived under restriction. Silence again becomes the chosen response. From a modern perspective, this behavior seems irrational. Why suppress information about ancient sites? Why restrict excavation when new knowledge would enhance understanding? The answer lies not in the past, but in the present. Information about human origins carries power. It shapes identity, belief, and authority. If evidence emerged that challenged foundational narratives, then institutions built upon those narratives would face destabilization. Suppression does not require conspiracy. It requires incentive. When the cost of disclosure outweighs the benefit, silence becomes policy. This is especially true when the evidence is ambiguous. As long as uncertainty remains, institutions can justify restraint as caution. They can frame silence as responsibility rather than control. And the longer silence persists, the more normal it becomes. Eridu exists within this space of controlled uncertainty. It is not denied, it is simply not explored fully. It is acknowledged but not pursued, known but not understood. The behavior surrounding the site mirrors the ancient story it is linked to. Access once existed, then it was restricted. Guardians were placed. Return was forbidden. Whether this parallel is coincidence or continuity is impossible to prove, but patterns repeat when systems persist. If Eden was sealed in the past, then modern silence may represent the continuation of that seal, not because everyone involved understands what lies beneath, but because enough people sense that opening it carries consequences beyond scholarship. And the story does not end there, because buried systems do not always remain dormant. Recent data suggests that something beneath Eridu may not be as inactive as official narratives would prefer. Ruins are expected to be silent. They collapse, settle, and fade into the background of the landscape. Whatever activity once defined them ends with abandonment. This is one of the quiet assumptions behind archaeology itself. The past is finished. What remains is static. When a site refuses to behave this way, it forces a reconsideration not only of history, but of the present. In the years following renewed satellite monitoring of the Middle East, a small number of anomalies began to appear in datasets that were never meant for archaeological study. These were not images designed to reveal ruins or structures. They were thermal readings, seismic noise patterns, and electromagnetic fluctuations gathered for entirely different purposes. And yet, when analysts later compared these readings to known locations, something unexpected emerged. The region surrounding Eridu did not behave like an inert archaeological site. Thermal data showed subtle but persistent irregularities. The ground temperature in specific subsurface zones remained slightly elevated compared to surrounding areas. The difference was not dramatic enough to trigger alarms or suggest volcanic activity, but it was consistent. Seasonal variation did not explain it. Human infrastructure did not account for it. The heat signature appeared anchored to the same subsurface geometry revealed by earlier imaging. At the same time, low-level electromagnetic disturbances were detected intermittently in the same area. These were not strong signals. They did not resemble modern transmissions. They appeared as brief pulses, short-lived, unpatterned, easily dismissed as noise, except for one detail. They repeated in roughly the same locations over time. Noise tends to drift, systems tend to persist. Seismographic data added another layer. On several occasions, microtremors were recorded beneath southern Iraq that did not align with regional tectonic behavior. They were shallow, localized, and brief, lasting seconds rather than minutes, too small to be felt by people on the surface, too consistent to ignore entirely. One event in particular drew quiet attention. A seismic pulse lasting approximately 17 seconds originating beneath the Eridu region. It was not classified as an earthquake. It did not match known industrial activity. It did not propagate in a way typical of natural fault movement. The official conclusion described it as unexplained but insignificant. Insignificance is a powerful word. It allows anomalies to exist without demanding interpretation. Individually, none of these signals prove anything. Thermal variation, electromagnetic noise, and microseismic activity can all occur for mundane reasons. What makes them notable is their overlap. Different instruments designed to measure different phenomena responding to the same hidden structure. This is not how random noise behaves. If Eden were simply an ancient city, there would be no reason for any ongoing interaction with the environment. The site would be thermally neutral, electromagnetically quiet, and geologically dormant. That is what ruins do. What lies beneath Eridu behaves less like a ruin and more like a remnant. This does not mean something is operating in the way modern machines operate. It does not imply consciousness or intention. It suggests persistence, residual activity. Systems do not vanish the moment they are shut down. They decay. They leak. They leave signatures long after their purpose is forgotten. Modern infrastructure behaves the same way. Abandoned reactors remain warm for decades. Decommissioned facilities continue to emit trace signals. Underground networks interact with their environment long after humans stop monitoring them. If a system beneath Eridu once existed on a scale larger than the city above it, then its decay would not be immediate. It would be slow, quiet, easy to overlook unless one knew where to look. This may explain the careful language used in official reports. Nothing is declared active. Nothing is described as dangerous. Everything is framed as inconclusive. The goal appears to be containment, not investigation. There is a reason why active ruins are more unsettling than destroyed ones. Destruction allows closure. Activity implies continuity. It suggests that the past is not entirely past. Ancient texts often describe the gods withdrawing rather than dying, systems shutting down rather than being obliterated. Guardians placed not to protect humans, but to protect something else. If Eden was sealed, then sealing does not necessarily mean erasure. It means isolation, separation. The system remains where it is. Humans simply no longer interact with it. Modern behavior around Eridu mirrors this logic. No one claims it is nothing. No one claims it is something. It exists in a controlled ambiguity that discourages curiosity while avoiding denial. This ambiguity may be intentional. Systems that are not understood but cannot be removed are best left undisturbed. Opening them without context risks consequences that cannot be predicted. The presence of residual signals does not tell us what Eden was or what it did. It tells us that whatever existed there has not fully vanished. Something remains embedded in the earth, interacting quietly with the present. This realization shifts the story again. Eden is no longer only a question of ancient origin. It becomes a question of responsibility. If a buried system still influences its surroundings, then the decision to ignore it is not neutral. It is a choice to preserve stability rather than pursue understanding. And the reason for that choice may lie not in technological or environmental risk, but in something far more unsettling, a philosophical danger capable of reshaping how humanity understands itself. The greatest risk posed by the truth is not that it might reveal unfamiliar technology or forgotten catastrophes. Those discoveries would be disruptive but manageable. Human history is full of shocks that were eventually absorbed. The deeper danger lies in what such a truth would do to the way humanity understands itself. This is the kind of danger institutions are built to prevent, not because they are malicious, but because their stability depends on certain assumptions remaining intact. Modern civilization rests on a quiet agreement about origins. Humans emerged gradually. Intelligence developed slowly. Progress is linear. Knowledge accumulates. Authority flows from innovation and control of resources in the present rather than inheritance from the past. These assumptions are not simply academic. They shape political legitimacy, religious meaning, economic systems, and social hierarchy. They tell us who we are and why the world is arranged the way it is. Evidence that challenges this framework does more than rewrite history. It undermines justification. If humanity did not originate solely through gradual evolution, but was shaped within a pre-existing system, then intelligence is not purely emergent. It is cultivated. That idea alone destabilizes the modern belief in human exceptionalism. It raises the possibility that consciousness was not discovered by us, but introduced or amplified under specific conditions. Once that possibility exists, it cannot be confined to archaeology. It spreads into ethics, governance, and identity. Religious systems would face a different but equally profound challenge. Many traditions are built around the idea that humanity occupies a unique moral position created through divine intention. If Eden was not a spiritual test but a controlled environment, then exile becomes a technical event rather than a moral fall. Salvation shifts from obedience to reconnection. That is not a reinterpretation most institutions are prepared to accept. Science would not escape unscathed either. Modern scientific authority is grounded in the idea that knowledge progresses through discovery. If ancient societies inherited advanced systems they did not originate, then discovery becomes recovery. Science becomes archaeology of lost frameworks rather than exploration of the unknown. This does not diminish science, but it alters its role. And roles define power. Political systems rely on origin stories as much as religions do. Nations are justified by history. Progress is used to legitimize inequality and authority. If humanity has already risen and fallen before, then permanence becomes illusion. Empires become temporary custodians rather than endpoints. That perspective does not encourage obedience. It encourages humility. This is why the danger of truth is often described in moral language, even when the threat is structural. We are told some knowledge is forbidden, dangerous, destabilizing. But what it destabilizes is not nature. It destabilizes narratives. The possibility that Eden was a system humanity once inhabited and then lost reframes the entire human story. It suggests that we are not climbing towards something new, but circling something old. That our drive to build complex networks, technologies, and global systems may be less about progress and more about return. An unconscious attempt to recreate conditions that once existed and were taken away. This interpretation casts modern technological obsession in a different light. Our fixation on networks' energy sources, artificial intelligence, and biological manipulation begins to resemble memory rather than innovation. We are rebuilding fragments of something without knowing what the complete system once was. If this is true, then uncovering Eden would not simply answer historical questions. It would force humanity to confront its unfinished state. The realization that we may not be complete by default, but dependent on systems we no longer understand is not empowering. It is unsettling. Institutions exist to manage collective anxiety. They provide continuity when uncertainty threatens cohesion. From this perspective, silence becomes a rational strategy, not a conspiracy, but a containment. Delay understanding until humanity is better prepared to absorb it. The problem with containment is that it assumes preparation can occur without knowledge. It assumes maturity develops independently of truth. History suggests otherwise. Growth requires confrontation, not avoidance. If something beneath Eridu still exists and still interacts with the world, then avoidance is not neutral. It is a gamble. A decision to let the unknown persist rather than to engage with it responsibly. The ancient story of Eden ends with guardians placed at the boundary, flaming swords turning in every direction to prevent return. This image has been read symbolically for centuries, but symbols often encode practical realities, barriers, deterrence, controlled access. Perhaps the guardians were not there to protect humans from knowledge, but to protect the system from misuse. Perhaps exile was not punishment but quarantine. If that were the case, then the most important question is not whether Eden existed. It is whether humanity has changed enough since losing it to deserve access again. This brings the story out of the past and into the present. Because the question of readiness is not historical. It is ethical. In the final part, we will step back from evidence and interpretation and confront that question directly, not as archaeologists or historians, but as participants in a species still trying to understand what it once was and what it is becoming. If Eden was sealed, then the act of sealing was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a long delay. A pause measured not in years or centuries, but in the slow accumulation of change within humanity itself. The ancient texts do not describe Eden being destroyed. They describe access being withdrawn, gates closed, boundaries enforced. Something remained behind the barrier, intact enough to require protection. This distinction is critical. Destruction ends a chapter, restriction preserves one. Throughout this journey, we have followed traces left in stone language, biology, and behavior. None of them on their own demand a radical conclusion. Each can be explained away in isolation, but together they form a pattern that refuses to settle into comfort. A city that appears complete at its birth. A language that arrives already capable of describing systems. geological layers that record sudden catastrophic disruption, heat signatures that defy simple natural explanation, genetic anomalies that suggest intervention rather than gradual drift, technologies that appear and vanish without lineage, a buried structure that behaves like infrastructure, modern silence that mirrors ancient restriction, residual signals that imply something has not entirely gone quiet. Patterns are how systems reveal themselves. If Eden was not a garden but an environment designed to sustain a particular state of humanity, then exile would have changed more than geography. It would have altered how humans lived, how long they lived, and how much they understood. Over generations, memory would replace function. Ritual would replace access. Myth would replace mechanism. This would explain why ancient traditions speak of a golden age followed by decline. Not because humanity fell morally, but because it was disconnected structurally. Life outside the system would be harsher, shorter, and more fragmented. Civilization would rebuild slowly, using fragments of remembered order rather than the original framework. In this light, human history becomes a record not of ascent, but of recovery, a series of attempts to recreate stability using limited understanding. Agriculture cities writing law technology all appear not as sudden miracles, but as compensations. Tools to survive outside a system that once made survival easier. The question that remains is not whether Eden existed. Absolute proof may never emerge and perhaps cannot. The more important question is why the idea of Eden persists so stubbornly across cultures and eras. Why so many traditions remember not creation but loss, not discovery but exile. Memory persists when something mattered. If something beneath Eridu still exists, then the delay is not complete. The system has not vanished. It has only been set aside. And that raises a final question that no institution can answer for us. What was humanity like inside Eden? Were we wiser, more cooperative, more restrained, or were we dependent, shielded from consequences, unable to grow beyond the protection of a system that did too much for us? Perhaps exile was not punishment but necessity. Perhaps humanity had to leave in order to become what it is now. And perhaps return is not guaranteed. Systems do not reopen simply because enough time has passed. They reopen when conditions are met. If Eden was locked, then the key was never hidden in the ground. It was placed in humanity itself. The ancient story ends with a warning not to return, but warnings change meaning over time. What once meant never may later mean not yet. If one day access were restored, the greatest danger would not be technological or environmental. It would be ethical. Power without maturity has always been humanity's most consistent failure. The silence around Eden may not exist to keep us ignorant. It may exist to give us time. Time to develop responsibility without protection. Time to learn cooperation without enforcement. Time to face consequences without insulation. If that is the case, then the final question is not whether Eden should be opened. It is whether humanity has become something that can be trusted with it. This story does not end with revelation. It ends with reflection. Because if Eden was real, then its purpose was never to be worshipped. It was to be understood. And understanding is not something that can be excavated. It has to be earned. If this journey stayed with you, feel free to like, share, or subscribe so we can continue exploring these questions together. Wherever you are listening from, I hope this story gave you something to reflect on. And for now, rest well. Good night.